Hello, everyone, and welcome to Current's webinar on the money, pay equity, and Pubmedia. This webinar is part of our special coverage of what people earn in public media and how organizations can work toward fairer pay for their employees. I'm Mike Jansen, I'm Current's digital editor, and today we'll be talking with two people who come at this issue from different directions that we hope will be complementary. Adam Livingston is Chief Operating Officer of Livingston Associates, which specializes in recruitment and executive searches for public media. Adam's work has given him insight into what people seeking executive roles in public media expect to be paid and how stations work to meet those expectations. He's also familiar with what information is available about salaries in the system and how sometimes that information falls short. And we're joined by Michaela Rodriguez, managing producer of podcasts at KERA in Dallas. Michaela has worked both in public and commercial media and has personal experience of what both industries can afford to pay employees. Now that she's returned to public media, she's working to ensure that her own station can pay its employees what they deserve. Thanks to everyone who has joined the webinar today, and we want you to participate in this conversation. Please share your questions using the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we also gathered some questions in advance that we'll be answering later in the discussion. And we'd like to thank our sponsor, Centralcast. First, I would just like to talk briefly about another big part of current salary coverage. Earlier this year, we fielded a survey in which we asked people in public media to anonymously share details of how much they earn and where they work. We got more than 1,900 responses and have presented these findings to our readers, as well as an interactive database of the responses. This was all part of our special coverage called On the Money, which if you haven't checked it out already, you can see at current.org/onthemoney. So why did we want to do a salary survey? Well, we had been talking about it for almost 2 years on and off, and it just seemed like more and more it was getting to be the right time. There's been growing interest in issues around pay and pay equity in public media, and staff and executive compensation has been a recurring theme in negotiations between unions and their employers. Also, we just noticed that there has never really been a survey comparable to what we wanted to do. There have been surveys of just journalists in public media, but we are interested in salaries of everybody in public media. And there have also been salaries of journalists who work in both public and commercial media, but we wanted to limit it to public media. So it was up to us to do it. And we're uniquely poised to do it because Current serves the audience of people who work in public media. And we knew that we had access to you and we could ask you to share this information. And we hoped that you would trust us enough to do it. So that's why we decided to undertake this finally. And we immediately saw a lot of interest throughout the system. So it seemed like a good time to do it. Now, before I share some of the top line results, it's important to keep in mind some of the caveats about this data so that we don't think that it's more representative of the system than it actually is. First, it's a self-selecting sample, obviously. People answered this survey because they wanted to. People are answering on the honor system. We have to trust that people put in all their information correctly. Some of the responses we got had flaws in one way or another, and we had to toss those out. So that was another issue. We didn't ask people to answer all the questions. So some of the responses we got were just partial. We didn't want to discourage people from responding. And this is also just a slice of the system. We ended up with about 1,900 usable responses. And according to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, in 2020, the number of full-time people working at public TV and radio stations was about 15,000. Now that doesn't include NPR, PBS, or support organizations within public media. So that's not everybody, but it's a lot. It's most of the system. And if you take that into account, and you take our number into account of about 1,900, that's about 12%. So that's the slice we're dealing with here. Also, we found that our sample appears to skew possibly a little whiter compared to what we know about the racial makeup of station employees through CPB data, and also a little more female. I believe the latest CPB data said that station employment breaks down to about half male, half female. We had a higher representation of females in our responses. This is our salary database, or a screenshot of our database, which is part of this project, where you can review the data and you can compare your salary to your colleagues. You can find this at current.org/salary survey. And we had help with analysis and visualization from Jacob Legess, who is a student innovation staffer at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. And I also want to thank Eric Schuler, a quantitative and computational research methodologist with American University, who advised us on designing and fielding this survey. So looking at a couple of breakouts of the data, first, a big issue that we've looked at before among executives, and we wanted to look at it with a broader angle, is how do salaries compare between men and women in the system? And among our respondents, we saw that the median salary for men was about 9% higher than it was for women. And we found a roughly equal gap between salaries among men and women in executive positions. We also wanted to look at salaries by age. And so one thing you notice here right off is this very large gap between up to 70 and then over 70. And maybe the lesson here is don't retire yet if you're thinking about retiring. But also keep in mind, we only got 5 responses from people over the age of 70, so it's a very small slice of our data. Now, you can also see a significant fall off in the median salary once you get to 40 and younger, and that's something to notice here as well. We also wanted to look at how salaries broke down across the type of the organization people worked for and the type of licensee if they were at a station. Now, the organization type rundown is maybe not all that surprising here. We saw that the median salary was highest among national networks and organizations, which is kind of what you would expect. The next highest among joint licensees, and joint licensees probably tend to be larger organizations and based in larger markets. TV and radio salaries were very close, as you can see here. But if you take a look at the executive positions at radio and TV stations, there's a notable difference between the salaries of executives in TV or at TV stations and executives at radio stations, which is worth pointing out. This is a little more interesting, salary by licensee type. There's not a whole lot of variation, but I didn't expect to see school board stations come first in median salary in this category. University licensees came in last in median salary, and we wondered whether this might be because more university licensees might be in smaller and medium-sized markets, which might have lower costs of living. But we did check that out, and actually, university licensees didn't follow that pattern. As I mentioned before, salary and pay equity issues have been a big issue recently in union negotiations and union drives at stations. And so we wanted to see if there was a correlation between salary and union membership. And these charts suggest that our data suggests that yes, there is. We wanted to look also specifically at news positions, since often it's news staffers that are leading union efforts. And the gap is even more pronounced among union staff and among union and non-union news staff. Now, there could be other factors to consider in whether union salaries are higher, though, and that would be, one question would be whether union employees tend to be in larger markets and at larger stations. And so we did a cost of living analysis on that, and that does seem to be the case, so you have to keep that in mind. Among union employees, and I know the text on this might be a little small for some of you on your screens, but the median cost of living index for unionized employees in our responses was 128, and it was close to 100, 99.6 among non-union. So that's a pretty big difference and something that we need to keep in mind when we look at these numbers. So those are some of our top line findings. And as I said, you can explore this in more detail at current.org/onthemoney. And now let's turn to our guests. We'll start off by talking with Adam Livingston, COO of Livingston Associates. And Adam in particular, we're going to talk with about this gap in salary information that we were aiming to address with our own survey. So Adam, you've said that public media is lacking information about salaries throughout the system. What information is currently available and how is it falling short of what is needed?
Yeah, absolutely. So really the only information available to stations is from CPB. We don't even have access to it personally. You have to be a station to get access to it. And we've just heard the feedback we get is that it's not cutting it. They do a poor job of equating similar positions. Honestly, that's one of the the problems we've had when we conduct salary studies is there's a lot of different variation within, for example, what a journalist does. And so it is certainly a challenge, but I think ultimately the data just isn't there, and it's a challenge that I think everyone realizes exists, and I don't know exactly what they will do, what we will do to get to it.
And what are the disadvantages of not having more information about salaries?
Yeah, absolutely. So really, at the end of the day, it comes down to, so there's this big conversation we're having about DEI and equity and equality. And every time studies are done about how to make things equitable for everybody, there's always evidence that people are being underpaid, that people of color are being underpaid, that women are being underpaid relative to the same job done by, honestly, it's white men. And so I think if we want to get to equity, true equity, I think having the information available to everybody is the way to get to that.
And so when this data is lacking, sometimes stations and organizations have to move on their own to gather the data, and that's something that Livingston Associates has been involved with. Recently, you worked on a compensation study for KNKX, one of the public radio stations in the Seattle market, and you looked at salaries at stations in comparable market sizes, and your findings really varied quite widely. Why were salaries so all over the place?
Yeah, actually, so that was an interesting study. That was only at the executive director level. And at the end of the day, when stations approach us and ask us to conduct these compensation reports, for a position like that, it was the board that contacted us and asked us to do a report. And for comparable positions, we were only able to get about 15 stations on board for that study. And it was interesting because there was no strong correlation between any of the things that we would expect there to be correlations between station size, the cost of living for the market, membership size. There was just no correlation. The dots were sort of all over the place. What you want to see is like this perfect trend line. You plot everything on a graph, and I don't know if you guys remember high school algebra, but there's this line, like a perfect line. Stations of this size are going to pay this much, and it just there wasn't any of that. My belief is that sort of stations operate as an island unto themselves. Boards set salaries. We saw small stations with huge salaries. We saw huge stations with or much larger, relatively larger stations with lower salaries. And so it's just sort of all over the place. So that made it really difficult to make any sense of it, just to come back to our clients and say, this is what you should be paying, because it was just all over the place.
Right. That's really interesting. And was it difficult to get stations to share their data with you, to share the salaries with you? Yeah,
we actually did a much bigger salary compensation report a couple of years ago that had many more positions. And we found there's a few different types of stations. Some stations say, yes, absolutely, count us in. Some stations say it's just going to be, right now it's going to be difficult. We don't have the staff. We don't have the resources to dump into this right now. And then some stations said, no, we don't want to share. We don't want to be a part of that. And I would say it's about a third, and a third of the stations that we approached.
So we've mentioned already the lack of data and how that could help to advance pay equity in the system. What else do you think would help to bring about better pay equity in public media? What are any other measures that people could take, or the things that we need to do to move this forward?
I mean, I think at the end of the day, it's transparency. And I think there's not much else that really can get us there, but making the data generally available. I think it's if we want to make sure that everybody is being treated with equity, I think just making sure that data is publicly available is the way to make that happen.
And now let's talk with someone else who has been thinking a lot about pay equity in the public media system. Michaela Rodriguez, Current's Tyler Falk, spoke with you for his story as part of our coverage because you volunteered to talk with us about salaries in public media. When people took our survey, we asked, would you be willing to be interviewed? And you were one of those people. When we tweeted a link to our story, you retweeted it and you said that the issue of fair pay in public media keeps you up at night. Why does it keep you up at night?
I say the reason for that is because I think about when I first started out, I started as an intern, unpaid. Then I was an intern at NPR. I was making $12.50, I think it was $11.50 or $12.50. And then I got hired as a news assistant and I went up to $22 an hour, which at the time seemed like millions of dollars to me. I didn't know anything about pay. I didn't know how much other people were making. I thought it was a really great salary. But then I had to start paying my student loans and I had to pay rent and I had to buy groceries and I started cutting corners and just doing things that looking back now, I'm like, I don't know why I thought it was a good idea to skip lunch every single day just so that I could have money. Or I wouldn't take vacations because I thought, oh, if I don't take vacations and I don't get hired on for a longer contract, then at least I'll have a savings account because they'd have to pay me out for these vacation days that I'm not taking. And at one point I had a second job and I just don't think that people should need a second job to be able to afford to have a first job.
Right. So a little about your career. You started out in public media with internships and temp positions at WITF in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and then NPR. Then you worked in for-profit media for Politico and Roll Call. You were laid off from Roll Call during the pandemic and you were freelancing. And when you considered joining KERA as a podcast producer and returning to public media, you had doubts. Why?
Yeah, so pay was definitely one of the things that I was concerned with just in public media in general. I was interviewing at a few different places and the pay was significantly lower. And that scared me because I didn't know if there was a path to being paid more, if there was a path to leadership, what that would look like. There aren't really any steps that anyone can follow. And it kind of seems like things are just decided because they are. Like there's no real reasoning behind anything. And in private media, it was very clear what my path would be. I always knew what my next job title would be. I knew when I would get a raise and I knew how much it would be usually. So I guess I missed that stability and I was really scared that I wouldn't be able to find a place like that in public media again.
Now you're in your position as managing producer of podcasts at KERA. And how are you working to bring about more equitable payment for the employees that you hire, which is something that your shop is looking at right now? You told Tyler that part of it involves an insane spreadsheet, your words. Tell us about that spreadsheet and what else you're doing.
Yeah, so I guess I should explain that I just love spreadsheets in general. Like I love checklists, I love like to-do lists, all of that. So my way of thinking was I want to see what other places are paying because we'll need to be competitive with private media, with public media. So I made a spreadsheet. It has 5 columns, I believe, location, job title, pay, and then the last column is I average all of the numbers for that title. And I'm just doing that so that I can see what number should be our base number in order to stay competitive and get the best candidates and to make sure that people have a salary that they can live off of.
And are you looking just at like podcast related jobs or is it broader than that?
Yeah, I tend to just look at podcast related jobs because I've noticed that there's not really a ton of overlap in titles and the expectations are very different between podcasting jobs and newsroom specific jobs. And the overlap isn't always one-to-one. So I've been mostly looking at podcast positions, production companies, things like that.
And similarly to what I was talking about with Adam, you're not finding a lot of resources to help you figure out what to pay people. And what has that been like trying to find this information?
It's really frustrating. Sometimes I'll find a position, I'm like, oh, cool, an associate producer. I'd love to know what that pays. I'll click on the link. It says nothing. I'll go to the person who maybe tweeted it out. The Writers of Color account will tweet at them, what does it pay? No one will respond.
I think we've been the subject of one of those Writers of Color tweets. Yeah.
It's a brutal response, but it's super frustrating. So a lot of what I'm going off of is like things that I can find. Sometimes Indeed will give the estimate. It's not exactly useful, but at least it's somewhere to start.
Right. So you're doing your piece. I mean, what do you think are a couple steps that the system needs to take to advance pay equity throughout the system?
Yeah, one of the biggest things that I wish is that we could all come together as a system and just decide on titles and responsibilities for those positions. Because what is a producer at one station might be considered an AP at another, or a PA might be doing the same work as an assistant producer at a different station. Some people use senior producer, others do not. And it's very confusing, and it's hard to know what to pay people. It's hard to know what their skills are. And then you get into this slippery slope of doing edit tests, which is free labor. And I don't want to have to do that. So that's one thing. And then the other thing I would love is if everyone started posting at least a band or a salary band or something like that on their job descriptions, so that people know what to expect and where they can come in, and if they can make that job work for them.
Here's a question that just was submitted to us for you about this. What have you found to be the median salary of podcast positions at stations? I don't know if you can grab that off the top of your head, but for like a producer, a host, a project manager, anything come to mind?
So for stations, median price is probably about 55,000 to 60,000. Private media, much higher.
Okay. We do want to answer your questions during this discussion, so please submit them using the Q&A feature, and we'll get to them soon. We also asked for some questions in advance when we were promoting this event, and we'll be getting to those in a little bit as well. If we can't get through all the questions today, we're going to try to answer some of them in upcoming reporting, because we'd like to keep this going as long as people in the system have questions about our data and about this pressing issue. Adam, let's go back to you with a few questions. Livingston Associates mostly works with medium-sized stations in the system. And you've said that station leaders often tell you they wish that they could pay their employees more, and that executives in commercial media, considering moves into public media, have different salary expectations. How are the salaries public media is paying affecting the kinds of leaders and employees that it can attract?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so let me sort of walk through how we get there. So our stations that reach out to hire us are typically in about the $2 million to $15 million range. You know, stations much smaller than that don't want to hire us, can't afford to hire us. Stations much larger than that have HR departments. So we have this band. And one of the things we do when we're starting that conversation is we, of course, ask what the salary for the position is. And everybody has sort of a band. And they do say, you know, we wish we could pay more often. At the same time, when we're hiring on our resume portal, if anybody who's applied through us will have seen, you select a salary band, your required salary band. I think everybody sort of has a required salary band in mind when they apply. We just use that information. So at the end of the process, when we're going back and proceeding with video interviews, we'll just take a look at what the targets salary set by the station is, and then we'll look at the target set by the candidates. And if there's a discrepancy, a significant discrepancy, we'll go back and we'll ask candidates, we'll say, this is the target compensation. Are you still willing to be considered with that in mind? And sometimes they'll say no, and sometimes they'll say yes. We sort of get everything in between. And it's totally understandable. And so we do absolutely do everything we can to make sure that we have that conversation up front and early on, so that we don't get down that process and get in trouble with it. It's a level of transparency. It's probably not as transparent as it could be, but we do try to do that. We also do, when our clients, when they're hiring us, say, here's what we're thinking of paying, what do you think? We often tell them sort of the higher you can afford to go, you'll start to see a correlation between candidates that have done the work in the past. They want, everybody wants a well-qualified, diverse candidate for whatever number they can afford. And we often end up encouraging our clients to consider pushing that higher if they can.
How often do you see candidates turn down a position because the station can't meet what they want?
It happens. We hope to get in front of that by having that conversation up front. But certainly people say, yes, I'd like to proceed knowing that, and then they still try to negotiate, and it just doesn't work out in the end. But we do like to believe that asking that question up front helps to get in front of that.
Should salary information be provided in job postings just as a matter of routine? What's been your experience with that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, it's changing. It is certainly evolving. It's a conversation we've had a lot more in the last year than we've ever had before. I think that, the challenge always is that our clients, their fear is that their ceiling is the candidate's floor. So they say, here's the top of the range, and candidates will come in and start the negotiating point from the top of there and try to go up from there. And we do certainly see that also, that when we make it very apparent what the salary band is, that candidates will try to negotiate above that. I think that having the conversation about transparency, having the conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion includes rethinking that. And we've encouraged several of our clients to post that, to make that more readily available.
Related to this, a question that came in during this conversation, one attendee asks, my station is part of a university and the university publicly posts salaries. Is this common? And has there ever been an effort to collect all of these salary sheets?
That's pretty common. I mean, our challenge is, so I like compensation work. Search is good. I like compensation work for a whole different reason. Like Michaela, I really like this, this very tenable information. It's concrete, and you can, make sense of it. The challenge is it's a lot of work. Compensation reports are a lot of work to get stations to participate, to take the data, to make sense of it, to clean it up, to do cost of living adjustments and all of this. It takes hours and hours and hours. And so that kind of work is fascinating to me. And I love the idea of it. The challenge is like finding the time and honestly the resources, the money to either hire new staff or to put all of our other work on pause so that we can do that work.
Right. And I'd like to add about that, because people have asked about this with our survey. People ask, well, did you try to incorporate the public data that's out there for colleges and universities that are public, and you can find salaries listed there. And at first I was considering, yeah, let's do that. If we don't get enough data, we can go grab that and put it in. But then I realized if the problem is if people answer the survey and are also in that data, we're going to get duplicate information. And because our survey was anonymous, we're not going to have any way to weed that out. So we couldn't do that with this data set. Like mixing the data would be too fraught. But maybe in the future, we could do some kind of project where we just take that data and do a separate analysis or something like that. But for this time, we decided just to go with the reader responses. So that was one issue that we had to deal with. So as I was saying before, Current has reported on the growing unionization in public media newsrooms. And in some of these campaigns, organizers are pointing to the difference between what the rank and file staff make at the station and what the station leader earns, the CEO might make. And is there a ratio that represents best practice for that?
For me?
Yeah.
That's a great question. If there is, I don't know what that is. The other thing I will say is that I believe, one of the things I love about working in public media is I believe that almost every time, the upper management have the best interest of staff in mind, that they're not looking to get over on anybody. When we have that conversation with our clients with the executive level, you never hear them say, we're going to try to pay them as little as possible. They often say we have the best interest of all the staff in mind, and honestly, I believe that. That's what I love about public media.
So as I said, we promoted this event asking people to submit questions in advance, and we're going to start taking on some of those. So here's one that I'd like you to take on, Michaela. How do you get senior leadership on board for publicly sharing salary ranges for hiring purposes? Is that something that you've been working on doing?
It's something that we do at KERA, and we've seen positive response to it. But I think the way to get senior leadership on board is really there's power in numbers. You need to hold leadership's feet to the fire and make it be known that it's expected and that it's the right thing to do and that it's respectful for the people who are applying to the jobs, and nobody's time is wasted from doing this. The station isn't let down by someone turning down the job because it doesn't pay enough. People who apply are able to see how much they might make from the lowest to the highest level, and what that means for them. So I think it's just the right thing to do, and you need to make it clear.
Another one for you. The gender pay gap is an ongoing issue in public media production, as in other industries. What steps should female employees take if they believe that they've been compensated at a lower rate than their male counterparts? Do you have any advice for this question asker?
Yeah, I think first what I would do is gather evidence. You can say, I'm being paid less than someone, and they would say, well, how do you know that? And then you can say, well, I asked,
Right.
and they told me. So always have evidence. I would also go through, if you have a DEI committee, I would get them on my side for sure. And I would also just talk to senior leadership. I feel very comfortable talking to my boss, to the CEO about pay. And I think that everyone should.
Here's one on a related note that you can both take, but Michaela, we'll have you take this on first. We were just asked this during this conversation. After looking at the report and taking all the various caveats into account for the data, it's clear to me that I'm being underpaid. How do you start this conversation at your home station? I'm at a point in my career where I'm ready for my next career pay jump, and I'm looking at positions at other stations, but I'd like to grow at my home station if the money is there. The space for advancement is open, but how can this study be leveraged to get more money?
I mean, I would take the study with me. I would say exactly what was just typed in that message. And I'd just be upfront and direct. Direct doesn't have to mean rude. It can just be honest. And I think that people respect that and understand, and also be prepared to hear a no. It could happen. And that might mean that you've outgrown your position, you've outgrown the station, and it's time to move on. That's always a possibility.
Adam, do you have any tips to offer there?
Well, yeah. Well, I think negotiating once you've been in the position for a while is certainly more of a challenge than negotiating up front. We see, especially in university licensees, they have rules about how much salaries can rise on an annual basis. And so that sort of hampers them. I think that, like Michaela said, sometimes there is a time where you have to make a move. And that's a wonderful time to really negotiate, your salary to the best of your ability.
All right, here's one that, Adam, you may be able to offer some advice on. A question from a general manager. I run a $1.3 million station, and when I tried to do a pay equity study, everyone I talked to said there's no real equivalent for our small rural station. The consultants I talked to work with NPR and bigger stations like OPB. I want our station to pay everyone well, but I can't tell what that should be like at a station our size. The CPB salary surveys are useful, but limited because they don't factor in COA and other factors. What should this general manager do?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It really is a challenge that we see often, that finding equivalent data is difficult. I think, again, I would love to do these. I would love to have a full-time sort of spin-off business where we're doing compensation reports. I think at the end of the day, at $1.3 million, there are several stations, if you can identify them, that are of a similar size. There's a good chance that they would be willing to work with you to sort that out. But you're right. It's hard work. It's hard to find that data. It could just be informal conversations with other leaders. And we do absolutely see a discrepancy between pays at small stations and giant stations, stations with resources and stations without. there's a difference between those. And so I think that really looking at equivalent size stations is probably your safest bet. But I wish I had a magical answer that was a great resource. I'm afraid I really don't.
Right. And that just points to the challenges we've been talking about of the information that's available for everybody. So here's one for you that just came in. In my experience, university licensees are often constrained in salaries needing to conform to other institutional administrative roles. Is that part of why university and college station median income could be lower than other types of licensees?
Absolutely. It absolutely is. One of the things I speak to people all the time about when they're asking about making a move and salaries, I honestly believe that the salary, it's an equation, right? Your compensation is an equation in your head, how much you're worth. And so salary, money is certainly at the foundation of that. I think it's certainly something that's easy to measure. And so it's when we go about these studies, it's a really important thing. I think, there are some other facets of that you can potentially negotiate even after you've been in the position for a while. Title, if you have a title change where it's a better, more appropriate title for you, typically that will come with a salary increase. You can negotiate vacation time. One of the things that I think is certainly the most important is personal development within a station, and mentoring. Going to your boss and asking for some sort of, going to conferences is a great one. Feeling like you make a difference. I think it's in public media at the end of the day. That's why people stick around. I don't think many people are in public media to get rich. I think feeling like you make a difference is really important. So there are ways you can find value from a job that may start out not paying as much. And I think, universities tend to have a better benefits package going into it than a lot of other stations. And so I think just sort of weighing that entire package and figuring out what's best for you is really important.
Michaela, I noticed you were nodding in agreement. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I just think that especially when you're trying to negotiate and you don't have anywhere money-wise you can go, I think conferences are super important. Reaching outside and finding fellowships you could do, collaborations with other stations, things that make your job more fulfilling and also add value to the station. I think it would be hard for leadership to say no to that.
Michaela, I've got a few more questions for you, but I want to take on a couple that we were asked about our study, just to answer a few quick questions. One attendee asked, in the survey, was type of station a consideration, news versus music? No, we didn't ask for that specific level of information. That's something we can consider next time around, but this time we didn't get into that. Also, another question about our survey: how representative do you think our data is of the current salary situation for people in public media, and what information do we think is missing or that we wish we had more of? I did talk a little bit about that when I presented the results. And like I said, we saw that we potentially had a higher proportion of women than the system as a whole, and also it skewed a little wider. So I think if we were to do this survey again, which we're talking about maybe doing, maybe not next year, but in 2 years, I think we would consider what steps could we take to get a better representation of people of color in the system, maybe reach out to some of the groups in the system and ask for help with promotion of the survey to try to get it out to more people, and see if that helps move the needle on that. Along those lines, we also got the question, how does pay equity break across race? And we were definitely interested in this, but you might have noticed when I presented the results earlier, there wasn't a slide on that. And that is because when we looked at the data, at least what we got, there was not really any predictable pattern based on race. I mean, we did not see in our results that people of color were uniformly being paid less than white respondents to our survey. But that could just be a function of who answered. So we can't say that that's true for the system as a whole. We don't know. We just know based on the data that we have. And what we got didn't really seem to add up to anything that followed any pattern. Michaela, this is another question that we got in advance of the webinar. Do you have any particular strategies for advocating for fair pay and advancement for Black and Indigenous employees and people of color in the workplace?
Yeah, so first things first, bring your evidence. So again, that would be salary data, what other people are being paid, track your praise throughout the year. So that when you're having these salary conversations, you can say, oh, but these are all the things that we've liked this year. This is how I've progressed. This is how things have changed. Also, the conversation shouldn't be once a year, I don't think. I think it should be something that's ongoing, something that you touch base on a few times a year, just to make sure that you're on track and that you know where you are going and that your manager is fully aware of what you want as the end goal. I would also say, again, seeking opportunities outside of your station. I would look at places like the Maynard Institute, Next Gen Radio, things like that that can help you build a network and a system of allies. And similarly, find an ally in your news org who you can work on projects with. And then I guess the last thing I would suggest is for projects, for opportunities, for committees, raise your hand and then choose yourself.
That's great advice. Now, we've heard that people can be reluctant to talk about salaries in public media. How do you start talking about it with colleagues, especially if you think that there might be resistance?
I prefer to do it face to face. It's a little hard now, but I found that over chat function is not good. There's a lot of miscommunication. It just opens a whole can of worms that you don't want to. So face to face is best. Video chat, fine. Generally, I'll offer my information first, just to show like I am coming to you. This is fully honest. This is not a trap. This is not a trick. This is just to make sure we have an equitable workplace. And then the conversation shouldn't just end after you've shared salaries. There should be some strategizing, some end goals, and just inviting more and more people into the conversation and coming at it with an understanding that some people just might not want to share that information. They might be scared. They might feel like if they make more money than you do, that you won't like them anymore. And that's their right, but you can still ask.
I think we're getting pretty close to our time, but we have time for, I think, one more question for both of you. I'm the only person in my organization with my role, and as far as I know, my role doesn't exist at other public media organizations. How do I know that I'm being compensated fairly when I can't compare notes with others?
I can take this one because this was true for me. I was looking for other people who have managing producer titles, and it was largely private media and then NPR. So where I started was with the NPR salary, which they have a union there, so it's much higher. And then I thought about what is my get out of bed number? What is the number that I feel most comfortable with, that I know I can maintain my current lifestyle, that is equivalent to the amount of work I would be doing, and also just feels comfortable. I don't feel like I would be struggling. And that's kind of how I decided. It's really a number that I set in my mind that worked for me. That might not always work. And if that's not your case, again, I would go to the private media numbers, see what they have, go to your cost of living calculator, figure that out, and then maybe average a number.
Adam, any advice there?
No, that's a great answer. I think, I mean, you got to figure out what your equation is. The station's got their own equation, and hopefully you can make it work between the two of you.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Adam and Michaela. You guys have been great, and you've got so much wisdom to share. I really appreciate it. I wish we had time to answer more of these questions that we've gotten, but we're going to look for ways that we can answer these questions maybe in a future story for our website, just a Q&A, run through some questions with a Q&A or something like that. And it's been a great discussion. So thank you so much. I want to tell everyone who's here to save the date for our next webinar, which is titled Pathways to Philanthropy. It's part of our Local That Works initiative. It will be October 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. The Local Media Association will share key insights from its inaugural Lab on Journalism funded by Philanthropy, including essential elements of a successful philanthropy pitch, mistakes to avoid, and case study examples from publishers. Look for an invitation to register in early October. So thanks again to Adam and Michaela for sharing their expertise and perspectives with us today. And I'd also like to thank my colleagues Matthew Seklecki of American University School of Communication and Julie Drizzen of Current for helping to produce this event. And thanks again to Centralcast for sponsoring. Today's webinar will be posted online so you can share it with your colleagues. Thank you for joining us, and please get in touch with us if you have any other questions about our coverage of salaries and public media that you'd like us to answer. And we will do our best to continue to report on this and bring new information to light. So thank you very much for joining us today.